Today we're going to come to Galatians chapter 2 and look at one of my favorite verses in the Bible, which talks about being crucified with Christ. So we're going to get to that phrase and what it means, but before we get there, I want you to realize something. And I almost always feel compelled to talk about this whenever I talk about the cross. And that is that the cross, it was not a piece of jewelry, like it is today. I mean, today we're so used to kind of people wearing crosses around their necks and that just kind of being a nice gold piece of jewelry or something like that. That's not what the cross started off. It started off as a symbol of death to those who would rebel against the Roman government. Like that is why it was the Jews who had to take Jesus before the Romans so that they would be the ones who would crucify them. It was a way of Rome making a statement that if you cross Rome, you're going to end up on a cross. That's what they would do with it. So also in addition to that, and thinking about how it is a symbol of this death, I want us to look at what Jesus said about being crucified from Luke chapter 9. Before we get into Galatians, I know that I said it's about Galatians, and we're going to get there, but let's look at what Jesus said first. Luke chapter 9. In Luke 9, beginning in verse 21, Jesus strictly warned them not to tell this to anyone. And he said, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of law. And he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life." So this is, he's talking about his own suffering. He told them this several times. We look at that and we're thinking, how could they not gather this? They still didn't understand what Jesus was getting at whenever he said that he's going to have to suffer, he's going to be killed, but then he's going to rise up from the dead. What's he even talking about? But then verse 23, he takes it just a little step further and he says, "Then he said to them all, 'Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their very soul? Whoever is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his glory and in the glory of the Father and of the holy angels.'" When you look at this passage, he is not only talking about his own death, burial, and resurrection, but he's talking about the need for all of his followers to take up their own cross daily and to follow him. Now, to us, we might kind of think about, well, what does it really mean to take up your cross and to follow him? There was no question about it at all during Jesus' day. When Jesus said, "You've got to take up your cross and you've got to follow me," that meant follow me to the death. Because, he says, that's where I'm headed and that's where you're headed too. It's kind of an odd thing, right? It's not a very motivational speech, right? But it's very, very important because this is what it means to follow Christ. Be willing to give up anything and everything, to take up your own cross and to follow him. To not be ashamed, to boldly proclaim about the Son of Man and who Jesus is and who Jesus was and who he always has been. So now whenever you look at what Jesus has said about taking up the cross and about crucifixion, that's where Paul gets it. And that's why Paul says statements like this. Now let's go to Galatians 2. In Galatians 2, verse 20, I love this verse, right? "I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." I can't help it, but every time I read this passage, every time I read this verse, I think about the song that goes along with that. And even kind of about a year ago, I even heard that there was more verses to that than just the one. But all I ever knew it from was just literally this one verse. And it's different from the NIV, so sometimes I kind of default to how the song goes. But the song literally just says this whole thing. And as you look at this statement that Paul is saying, we need to be able to say the same thing as well. So we're going to take a look at kind of generally what Paul was saying, but also specifically like what he was saying within its context. But let's kind of take a look at it in different stages. So first, let's kind of look at this just a little bit closer. Now I've put it, this is the same passage, okay? But now I've just kind of grouped these thoughts together. And I've also color-coded it a little bit. I don't know, this is something that I guess I've kind of unlocked that I can really do this, and I've started kind of using this a little bit more. But here, I'm going to use the color red to be some type of symbol of like sin or death or something like that. Now right here, he's talking about, look, being crucified with Christ, he no longer lives. So like that's the end of his life at the top, okay? And then this green at the bottom, he talks about life. So this green is going to represent life, or at least, how we should live. And right here he says, I now live in the body. And then he says, what does that look like? I live by faith. So as you look at this passage, he at first is talking about death. He's talking about being crucified, which is death, right? And he says, I no longer live. And then down at the bottom, he does talk about life, but then he says, I now live. Okay, so the life that I now live. So it's not like he has actually died, right? Or, he's using that as a symbol, right? Because the life that he is living right now is living by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. And here at the heart, I know that I've kind of overlooked this, right? Because I've talked about the red at the top, I've talked about the green at the bottom, but now I colored this blue in the middle. This blue in the middle is this kind of thing that connects the two thoughts. Because Paul is at the top saying how he died, but then how he lives. Well, how is that possible? They come together in the middle. And he explains that Christ lives in me. That's what it means to take up your cross daily and to follow him, is for Christ to live in you. For your life to not necessarily be your own, but to be Christ. Or to put it another way, now let's be reminded of what Paul said in Colossians 3, verses 3 and 4. He said, for you died and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. Now, I know that was several weeks ago that we looked at that passage, but I mean, he's saying the same type of thing, right? That Christ is your life. Christ lives in you. That's what it means to be crucified. That's what it means to no longer live, because you don't live for yourself. You live for Christ. So now, right here in this verse, you see where we're headed, okay? This is where we're heading. We're getting to this, and this is what we're going to be looking at, is this passage right here about this death, but also this life that we have and how it's really Christ who lives in us, okay? Now let's get to this place, okay? So we're going to back up, and we're going to look kind of practically. What does this look like in everyday life? Because the verses leading up to this, I believe, help explain what this passage is. Now, I mean, I love this verse, and I like to take it just by itself. But there's a really cool thing whenever you back up a little bit. So let's back up, and let's take a look at it together. We're going to back up to verse 11. I know this is going to seem like an odd place to back up to. And we're going to see whenever there's a little bit of tension in the early church. Because I want you to realize, we look at the church today and we see tension, right? Let's just be honest. You look at the church in the first century, and guess what? You see tension. What do we do about that? What do we do with it? Well, Galatians 2:11. When Cephas, that's another name for Peter, when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face. So it's Paul opposing Peter to his face. Why? Because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas, in front of all of them, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? Okay, so let's take all this in. Now, I will give you that this passage is probably not going to mean as much to us as what it meant to them, because I'm not asking you to think the exact same way. I'm just asking you to understand what's going on right here. Because once you understand what's going on right here, then you can apply it to modern day situations. Because this exact situation is not likely going to come up for us. But similar ones could. And here's the situation. So you have Peter, a prominent member of the church, right? A leader in the church. And then you have also Paul. So Peter and Paul, and what Paul is saying is that he had to oppose Peter to his face. Why? He stood condemned. The words that Paul uses is condemned. That's why I used red. Okay, I'm still carrying that over about kind of sinning and missing what he's supposed to be about, right? Verse 13, hypocrisy. That's another way that he's missing it. In fact, by his hypocrisy, he's leading other people astray. He's even leading Barnabas astray. And to us, when you realize that Barnabas, that's not even his name, but that name that he was given, that nickname that he was given, it means son of encouragement, because he was so encouraging of Paul. But this man who was so encouraging of Paul is being led astray by this hypocrisy. It's a big deal. What is this hypocrisy doing? Well, every time I read this, I kind of think about like going back to middle school or high school, because it kind of seems like this. And every once in a while you'll maybe watch a movie, and I don't know if this is kind of stressed as much as what it used to be, but I know that whenever I was growing up, it was a big deal that which table you got to sit with. If you sat with the cool kids or the different groups of people, and that was something that was really taught whenever I was younger. And it was like, you've got this group of people over here, you got this group of people over here, and which table are you going to sit with? Well, really, oddly enough, that's kind of the same type of thing that's going on right here. Because apparently you had these Jews and Gentiles that they could intermingle in this church. Okay, this church is it's a pretty big deal because during this time, um, well, there was a lot of people in the church that came from a Jewish background. But the Gentiles, whenever they started learning about this faith and started adopting this faith as their own, what does that mean about them? What does that mean about the fellowship that they can have? Well, in this church, they were able to have fellowship together. They were able to sit down and eat meals with one another. Peter was able to sit down with the Gentiles. But then, whenever James came in verse 12, whenever James came, who James is kind of this representative, he's a very prominent leader in the church in Jerusalem, and he is someone who is, very, very Jewish about everything that he does, right? So whenever he came in, whenever people who were around him, came in, what Peter starts doing is he retreats from the one table and he goes over to their table. So he withdraws from the Gentiles and he goes to the Jewish people. That's the hypocrisy. That's why he is standing condemned. And that's also why Peter had to be opposed to his face right here. Because what he was doing was such a big deal. And what Paul was getting at in verse 14 is that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel. The truth of the gospel. What is the truth of the gospel? Let's keep reading. Verses 15 through 18. He's going to get into it a little bit more. And this is what the truth of the gospel is. Because Peter was living as if there's a difference between the Gentile believers and the Jewish believers. Is there a difference in Christ? Verse 15. We who are Jews by birth and not sinful Gentiles know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. So we too have put our faith in Christ Jesus, that we might be justified by faith in Christ, and not by the works of the law. Because by the works of the law, no one will be justified. But if in seeking to be justified in Christ, we Jews find ourselves also among the sinners, doesn't that mean that Christ promotes sin? Absolutely not. If I rebuild what I destroyed, then I really would be a lawbreaker. So now you see I'm still using these two colors, right? Okay, but now they're flipped a little bit. You got the sin down at the bottom, and then you got the life at first, because this life and what we're supposed to do. This is the truth of the gospel. The truth is that we are justified by faith in Jesus Christ. That's what verse 16 says. It's not by the works of the law. But then, the response to that might be, okay, so we can just do anything we want, right? No. Verse 17. The response is absolutely not. Christ doesn't promote sin. You can't just do anything and everything that you want. That's not what he's getting at. He's just saying the works of the law are not going to bring justification for us. So this idea about being able to do anything that you want, no, that's exactly why Paul was opposing Peter to his face, is because you can't just be like that. You have to realize we are all justified. We are all saved by our faith in Jesus Christ. That's how we're justified. It's not by the works of the law. It's by our faith. Now we come to this passage here. Now we're getting to verse 20 again. Verses 19 through 21. For through the law I died to the law, so that I might live for God. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing. So see, the gospel, it does not rely on the law, and neither should you. Right here, the way that he's talking about it is in verse 19. He explains to us why he can say in verse 20 that he was crucified with Christ and how he no longer lives. Well, how did that work? Well, he said it in verse 19 that through the law he died to the law. Now, likely this was going to be a harder lesson for the Jews who were becoming Christians during the first century than it is, today, because we're kind of a little bit farther removed, right? Or is it? Have we found new ways to rely on the law for our salvation? So that we could be saved by following the law, some way about being able to check boxes off. We are saved by faith in Christ Jesus. I mean, look at this passage and you see that he talks about how he died to the law, but then he's living for God. That's what he says in verse 19. The same type of thing is stated in verse 20. He says, crucified with Christ, and then I live by faith in the Son of God. That's how we live. That's how we put our faith in the Son of God and what he has done for us. And remember, at the heart of it, okay, right in the middle of it, you got the life and the death passages, but then right in the middle of it, Christ lives in me. So this is what we are called to do. We are called to live by faith in the Son of God. We are called to live for God. We are called to have Christ living in us. Because if we could do it on our own, if we could justify ourselves, then Christ died for nothing. But we know that that's not God's plan. We know that that's not what God decided. Why would Jesus have been crucified if it wasn't necessary? It was necessary. And we've got to accept that sacrifice, to allow that sacrifice, and to follow him. Remember the words of Jesus that if you want to be a disciple of Jesus, take up your cross daily and follow him. That means devote your entire life to following him. Now, that does mean that there are going to be some things that you are going to be doing, right? But it's not like you're trying to justify yourself by doing those works. I've heard it stated like this, and I think this is kind of one of the best ways of wording it, is that the good works that we do as Christians, we do them because we have been saved, not in order to be saved. Our salvation has already been taken care of. We are called to accept that plan of salvation. We are called to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. We are called to devote ourselves to him, to be crucified with him, to take up our cross daily, and to follow him wherever he leads us. That's what he's asked of us. That's what he asks of them, and that's what he asks of us today as well.